Assalamu alaikum ji. My name is Humair Hashmi and I am your instructor for History and Systems of Psychology. We are into our 40th lecture. Before we start today, let us review what we had seen in lecture number 39. मैंने आपसे ये भी गुजारिश की हुई है कि आप अगर अयादा करते रहेंगे जो कुछ भी आपने सीखा है, जो कुछ भी आपने पढ़ा है, तो आपको अगला मवाद समझने में आसानी रहेगी. So I hope that you are following that advice and you are looking at what we have done in the past. In reviewing the last lecture, you will recall that in the last two lectures we had been talking about different methodologies that psychotherapists or people who treat mental disorders adopt for the treatment of diseases of the patients that come to them. और वो दो broad categories जो थी जिनका हमने नाम लिया था in lecture 38 and 39 वो थी, बताइए. Yes, psychological approaches or psychological methodologies and biological approaches or biological methodologies. जितने भी तरीका हायकार हैं ज़हनी अमराज के इलाज के लिए, वो तमाम के तमाम इन्हीं दो कैटेगरीज में शामिल किए जाते हैं. इनके अलावा जो तरीक़ाकार हैं वो माहिरीन नफ्सियात के तरीके नहीं हैं, वो उनके तरीके नहीं हैं जो क्वालिफाइड स्पेशलिस्ट्स, डॉक्टर्स, मेडिकल मैन हैं. वो दूसरे लोगों के तरीके तो हो सकते हैं जिनकी वजह से मरीज़ बिगड़ सकें, ख़राब हो सकें, अमराज ख़तरनाक हद तक पहुंच जाएं. इसलिए ये भी बताना मैं ज़रूरी समझता हूँ कि इन दो कैटेगरीज़ के अलावा जिनका हमने ज़िक्र किया, और ये कैटेगरीज़ हैं, ये तरीका हाय इलाज नहीं है, ये कैटेगरीज़ हैं, इनमें बहुत से तरीके शामिल हैं. इन दो कैटेगरीज़ के अलावा जब आप नफ्सियात से आगाही हासिल कर लें तो इस बात का ख़ास ख्याल रखें कि अगर आपको किसी मरीज़ को रेफ़र करना है तो आप इन्हीं दो कैटेगरी से मुतल्लिक तरबियत याफ्ता लोगों की तरफ उनको रेफ़र करें. और जो वैसे ही लोग बोर्ड लगा के बैठे हैं सड़क पर, जिनकी पास कोई डिग्री या क्वालिफ़िकेशन नहीं है, उनकी तरफ उन लोगों को, ज़हनी अमराज वाले लोगों को, ज़हनी मरीज़ों को रेफ़र ना करें. मैं समझता हूँ कि ये बहुत अहम नुक्ता है और आपकी इस हैसियत से कि आप नफ्सियात के तालिब इल्म हैं, ये ख़ास आपका फ़र्ज़ है कि आप इस बात की निशानदही करें कि जो ज़हनी अमराज के से बेचारे शिकार हैं, ज़हनी अमराज का जो अफराद, वो इन्हीं दो किस्म के लोगों से, इन्हीं दो किस्म के माहिरीन से रब्ता करें और इस दायरा हायकार से जो बाहर हैं लोग, उनसे रब्ता ना करें. बहुत ज़रूरी बात है. चलिए इससे आगे चलते हैं. पिछली दफ़े, दैट इज़ लेक्चर 39, वी टॉक्ड अबाउट टू अप्रोचेज़ related to humanistic methodologies and we talked about certain other approaches related to biological methodologies. The psychological methodologies that we talked about related to, number one, humanistic approach to the resolution of or to the cure of mental problems. और आपको याद होगा humanistic approach assume करती है, humanistic approach का ये मफरूज़ा है कि एक शख्स में अपनी बीमारी से निजात हासिल करने का पोटेंशियल मौजूद है. All that a person who suffers from mental disease requires is a warm atmosphere and an understanding person who can reflect, who can understand his issues and problems. और इस रेफरेंस में हमने एक बड़े माहिर नफ्सियात का नाम लिया था जिसका नाम था, जी हाँ, कार्ल रॉजर्स. और इसी जुमरे में हमने दूसरा जो तरीका आपको बताया था वो था ग्रुप साइकोथेरेपी या ग्रुप अप्रोच टू द ट्रीटमेंट ऑफ मेंटल डिसऑर्डर्स। इसमें हमने इसके दो आपको तरीके बताए थे, एक जिसका नाम मैंने आपसे पहले कहा था साइकोड्रामा, और दूसरा फैमिली थेरेपी। ये दोनों आपको याद होंगे। फैमिली थेरेपी से मुतल्लिक कुछ आज भी हम बातें करेंगे, इसलिए फैमिली थेरेपी को मैं थोड़ा सा और आपके जहन के में थोड़ा सा रिवाइज करा दूं। फैमिली थेरेपी लुक्स एट द प्रॉब्लम ऑफ ए पेशेंट फ्रॉम द पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू ऑफ ए होल फैमिली। फैमिली थेरेपिस्ट्स बिलीव that the dynamics of the family, जो एक शख्स के ख़ानदान या कुंबे में बाहमी ताल्लुकात हैं, जो उनके आपस के रिश्ते हैं, उसकी वजह से भी एक जहनी मरीज़ जो है वो उसका मर्ज जो है वो बढ़ सकता है या पैदा हो सकता है। इसलिए फैमिली थेरेपिस्ट्स इंटरवीन, इन्वॉल्व द फैमिली मेंबर्स। एक और बात पॉइंट आउट कर दूं जो हमारे यहाँ एक शायद किसी हद तक कंफ्यूजन है। व्हेन वी टॉक ऑफ फैमिली इन रिलेशन टू द यूरोपियन और द अमेरिकन कॉन्टेक्स्ट, देन फैमिली ओवर देयर मीन्स द मदर, द फादर एंड द चिल्ड्रन। वहां पर फैमिली का तस्वुर जो है वो हमारी फैमिली के तस्वुर से थोड़ा सा मुख्तलिफ है। वहां पर फैमिली जो है वो एक माँ और बाप और बच्चों पे मुश्तमिल है, जबकि हमारे यहाँ जो फैमिली है, इस खित्ते में जो फैमिली का तस्वुर है, बरे सगीर, पाक व हिंद, बांग्लादेश, श्रीलंका वगैरह में, वो एक्सटेंडेड फैमिली है फ्रॉम देयर पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू। वो क्या है? हमारे यहाँ माँ बाप, बच्चे और माँ बाप के माँ बाप और माँ बाप के बहन भाई भी आमतौर पर फैमिली में ही शामिल किए जाते हैं। एक ही जगह रहते हैं, आमतौर पे उनका किचन भी, उनका खाना पकाना भी एक होता है, आमतौर पे उनकी ज़मीन या कारोबार भी एक है, आमतौर पे उनके बैंक अकाउंट्स या जो उनका सरमाया है वो भी पूल्ड है। तो उनके रिसोर्स, उनकी लेबर और उनका रहन सहन पूल्ड टुगेदर है। हमारे यहाँ इसलिए फैमिली जो है वो एक्सटेंडेड फैमिली है। वहाँ बहुत से लोग शामिल हैं उसमें फैमिली में, सिवाय माँ बाप और बहन भाई के दूसरे लोग भी शामिल हैं। तो ये नुक्ता नज़र ज़रूर जहन में रखना चाहिए आपको कि जब हम फैमिली थेरेपी की बात करते हैं तो वहाँ की फैमिली थेरेपी और हमारे यहाँ की फैमिली थेरेपी थोड़ी सी मुख्तलिफ है। चलिए इससे आगे चलते हैं। और हमने आपको बताया था पिछले लेक्चर 39 में that there are 3 methods that you may have within the approach of what we had called the biological approach, and those 3 subcategories within the biological approach were, can you recall? Number 1, drug therapy. Number 2, ECT or electroconvulsive therapy. And number 3, psychosurgery. और आपको ये भी याद है ड्रग थेरेपी मीन्स कि अद्वियात के ज़रिए इलाज करना जहनी अमराज का। फिर ECT जो है वो माइल्ड इलेक्ट्रिक करंट से इलाज किया जाता है जहनी मरीज़ का, उसके दिमाग पे माइल्ड इलेक्ट्रिक करंट का झटका दिया जाता है। और साइकोसर्जरी हमने आपको बताया था, दैट इज़ सर्जिकली रिमूविंग ए सर्टन पार्ट ऑफ द ब्रेन ऑफ ए पर्सन हु इज़ सफरिंग फ्रॉम ए मेंटल डिसऑर्डर। हमने आपसे ये भी गुजारिश की थी कि ECT एंड साइकोसर्जरी आर रेयरली यूज्ड, particularly psychosurgery is very rarely used because it is the most extreme form of treatment and it is irreversible. ये वापस नहीं जा सकती। एक दफ़े अगर एक शख्स का दिमाग जो है उसका कुछ हिस्सा सर्जिकली रिमूव कर दिया जाए तो फिर वो वापस नहीं पहुंच सकता। इसलिए इसमें इसका इस्तेमाल साइकोसर्जरी का जो है वो बहुत रेयरली किया जाता है। हमने ये भी बताया था आपको कि ECT और साइकोसर्जरी से मुतल्लिक अभी तक हमें ठीक से पता नहीं चला कि इसकी वजह क्या है कि ये कामयाब क्यों है, इलाज ये कैसे कामयाब हो जाता है। और हमने ये भी बताया था आपको कि डिपेंडिंग अपॉन द नेचर ऑफ द डिजीज, डिपेंडिंग अपॉन द सिविरिटी, एक मर्ज की शिद्दत और एक मर्ज की कितनी अरसे से वो लाहक है एक शख्स को, इन दो चीज़ों पे मुनहसर है कि हम कौन सा तरीका अख्तियार करेंगे। वेदर ए साइकोथेरेपिस्ट इज टू बी इन्वॉल्व और वेदर ए साइकाट्रिस्ट इज टू बी इन्वॉल्व। क्या आपको याद है साइकोथेरेपिस्ट और साइकाट्रिस्ट में फ़र्क क्या है? मैंने पिछली दफ़े आपसे ये बताया था, ए साइकाट्रिस्ट इज ए मेडिकल डॉक्टर, ए साइकोथेरेपिस्ट इज ए साइकोलॉजिस्ट। और साइकोथेरेपिस्ट uses psychological approach to treatment of mental disorders and a psychiatrist uses biological approach to the treatment of mental disorder. ये हमने पिछली दफ़े तय किया था और हमने बात यहाँ ख़त्म की थी कि ड्रग थेरेपी के अलावा जो बायोलॉजिकल अप्रोचेस हैं उसमें ECT और साइकोसर्जरी जो हैं वो कम इस्तेमाल की जाती हैं। इसी लिंक को आगे थोड़ा सा बढ़ाते हैं एंड लेट अस टेक ए लुक एट अनदर important development that took place in the 20th century in the field of psychotherapy or in the field of treatment of mental disorders, and that is called the anti-psychiatry movement. Anti-psychiatry movement is an offshoot of treatment methodologies. It was a revolt against the treatment of mental disorders by severe means such as psychosurgery or such as ECT or such as excessive usage of drugs. पहली तो बात समझने वाली इस रेफरेंस में यह है कि एंटी साइकेट्री इज ए मूवमेंट and not a methodology. It consists of 3 or 4 systems of treatment of mental disorders. दूसरी समझने वाली बात यह है इससे मुतल्लिक that it arose as a revolt, as a rebellion against the usage of extreme methods such as excessive usage of drugs, such as ECT and such as psychosurgery. एंटी साइकाट्री को समझने के लिए मेरा ख्याल है अगर मैं आपको एक बहुत मशहूर तजुर्बे के बारे में बताऊं तो आप एंटी साइकाट्री मूवमेंट को समझने में आपको आसानी होगी। A very famous psychiatrist, a psychologist by the name of D.L. Rosenhan came to the conclusion, as other psychiatrists had come to the conclusion, that psychiatric methods, biological methodology of treatment of mental disorder is not really appropriate. So, they were of the view that mental hospitals perhaps are not the right places for the treatment of mental disorders. What Rosenhan did was that he collected similar people with similar ideas, and 8 or 9 of them who were highly qualified, one of them himself a PhD doctor and a trained psychiatrist, Dr. Rosenhan, and others were highly qualified people. They registered themselves in various institutions, mental institutions across the United States, posing as mental patients. इन नॉर्मल और पढ़े लिखे लोगों ने ये रोल प्ले किया कि ये ज़हनी मरीज बन गए और ज़हनी मरीज़ों की हैसियत से अमेरिका की मुख्तलिफ जो हस्पताल थे उनमें इन्होंने दाखिला ले लिया और on the average they remained there for 19 days. Some people stayed in the hospital for 8 days and some people for over a month. But on the average these people stayed there for 19 days. And they reported, as they entered, they reported that they hear voices. Apart from this report that they hear voices, they told everything about themselves truthfully. बिल्कुल अपने बारे में उन्होंने तमाम बातें सच बताई, सिवाय इस बात के कि उन्होंने ये कहा कि वो आवाजें सुनते हैं. Now we know, and you know of course, that hearing voices when there are no voices is a symptom of hallucination. And hallucination is usually linked to schizophrenia. So, they were diagnosed as schizophrenics by the people in the mental institutions across the United States, diagnosed them as schizophrenic patients even when all other symptoms that they described, all other activities that they described, all other qualifications that they described were completely normal, except for this instance that they related that they lied, that they hear voices. They were diagnosed by all the institutions as schizophrenics and admitted to the hospitals and treated like patients. Based upon these experiments, Rosenhan and his associates concluded that mental institutions are not really a place where treatment of mental disorder can actually take place, because the institutions had failed, repeatedly had failed in the case of all these 8 people, repeatedly failed to diagnose them as normal people, which they were, and diagnose them as schizophrenics, which they were not. That was the basis, one basic conclusion of Rosenhan's experiment. Another was that while these people were there, who were completely normal and educated people, they were treated very cruelly. So Rosenhan concluded that patients in mental asylums, mental hospitals are treated cruelly and without any pity. Another conclusion they had drawn was that mental patients are normally treated as some people who have negative personalities, and they are considered less than human beings. Mental patients, in their point of view then, were treated in a way that the treatment left on the inmates a most negative effect. Now, based upon these conclusions that they drew after having become members in mental institutions, they also looked at some statistics. And the statistics spread all over the United States, that 80% of people who are admitted to mental institutions, who are admitted to mental hospitals, come after they are released, after they have been treated and released from mental hospitals, revert back to their diseases and come back to the mental hospitals. What does it show? It shows that the biological methodologies adopted in mental hospitals, Rosenhan's research showed, was inadequate in diagnostics, was cruel, was pitiless, and even when it succeeded in helping the patient to become normal functioning, even then 80% of the people who were released from hospitals came back to the hospitals for readmittance. Based upon all of this, the anti-psychiatry movement started. And the basic premise of the anti-psychiatry movement is that psychiatrists or the biological methodology fails to understand the underlying problem of a mental disease. Therefore, other than biological approaches have to be adopted in order that a person may be treated. One of the important, one of the prominent, one of the pioneers of the anti-psychiatry movement was a British psychiatrist by the name of R.D. Laing. R.D. Laing was born in 1927 and he died in 1989, as you can see it on your screen also. The other important, prominent anti-psychiatry doctor was Aaron Asterson. Both of these, R.D. Laing and Aaron Asterson, we'll talk about today. But first, about R.D. Laing. One of the famous books by R.D. Laing, by the title of The Divided Self, appeared in 1959. And The Divided Self, the book, is considered one of the basic contributions to anti-psychiatry movement. In the book, Laing puts forward the view that mental disease, particularly schizophrenia, is due to a division in the self. And what is this division in the self? In order to be able to understand this division in the self, let us take a look briefly at what is called existential philosophy. Existential philosophy, one of the main tenets of existential philosophy is that a person's existence is supreme, that other things are secondary to the existence of a person. What he does is essence, what he is existence. And so long as a person feels a reality, even when the reality may be different, for him existential reality is the reality. आपको याद है गेस्टाल्ट स्कूल वालों ने भी कुछ ऐसी ही बात कही थी. They also gave us the concept of the geographical field and the perceptual field. Remember that? Geographical field is the field that exists in reality outside us, and perceptual field is a person's view of that. A person's view is for him is the real one. The geographical reality, जैसे मैंने आपको पहले भी example दी थी, if you are walking down in your lawn and you see a twig and think that it's a snake, you would be feeling the fear that you would feel when you see a snake. That is because geographical reality is that it is a twig, a piece of wood, a branch of the tree, but your perceptual reality is that it's a snake. One of the tenets of existential philosophy says that we react to perceptual reality. And that is the basis of Laing's divided self concept, that our self becomes divided as what we feel and what we see the body to be, that there is a psychological existence and there is a physical existence. And this split leads to mental disease. Mental disease, conversely, is a person's view, in Laing's point of view, of how the world is, of how other people are. The world may be different, other people may be different, but his view of those people and his view of the world is what is important to him. Looking at it from the angle of the outsider, if a person feels that people are plotting against him, that is the reality for him. If a person feels that people are not interested in him, then that is the reality for him. People may not be plotting against him, people may be feeling for him, but so long as he is feeling what he is feeling, that is the reality for him, and he is reacting to that reality. When we, Lying says, when we label such people who react to their existential reality as schizophrenics, we are doing them an irreparable damage. Schizophrenics, in the point of view of Lying, are those people who live in their own reality, in their own existential reality, which is real for them, but which is not real for the world outside. Where does the problem lie? The problem does not lie with the patient, because the patient is reacting to what he knows to be real. Other people don't see that to be real. And that is where the self becomes divided, and that is where a mental disease begins, such as schizophrenia. Treating such a disease, in Lying's point of view, by usage of drugs is inadequate, because the person, in his own point of view, is not mad. The world outside considers him to be mad. The person is not what the world sees him to be. For him, he is existing in his own reality. Okay? That is then the point of view of the anti-psychiatry pioneer R.D. Lying about mental disease. अभी उनका तरीक़ाकार क्या है? How does R.D. Lying suggest that we treat mental disorder? If they say, if he has said as he had, that psychiatry is an inadequate method, that using ECT or using psychosurgery or using drugs excessively for the treatment of mental disorder is cruel, is inappropriate, then what is the method that Lying suggests can be used for the treatment of mental disorder? He calls that method metanoia. As you can see on your screen also, METANOIA, metanoia. Metanoia is, in Lying's point of view, creating a new mental state. हमें एक ऐसा ज़हनी झुकाव बनाना है जिसको वो मेटानोया कह रहा है, और उसका क्या तरीका है मेटानोया बनाने के लिए? यही एंटी साइकेट्री का एक दूसरा बुनियादी आंसर है. मेटानोया कैन बी अचीव्ड बाय a mixture of a number of methodologies that we use in daily life also. And what is that mixture? We can use dance, we can use painting, we can use discussion, we can use seminars, we can use dialogue, we can use other exchange of ideas. All of these creative expression of the self and exchange of ideas, discussion and dialogue, all of these put together constitute what will lead to metanoia. इसलिए the treatment that is suggested by anti-psychiatrist R.D. Lying consists of a number of methodologies. Now, all of those numbers of methodologies, are they possible in a clinic? Well, of course not. One cannot have music and dance classes in a clinic. One cannot have painting, and one cannot have group discussions and seminars in the clinic of a conventional psychiatrist. So, what is required? What is required is a separate place where all of these activities can be undertaken. And that is exactly what R.D. Laing and other anti-psychiatrists did. They established a place that they called Kingsley Hall. And Kingsley Hall was a kind of a mental institution, except it wasn't called a mental institution. It was called a Kingsley Hall, where people who suffered from schizophrenia and other chronic mental diseases, and you remember we had distinguished day before in three lectures ago or 2 lectures ago that there are, if we put all of the mental diseases together, we can have 2 classes. The more severe ones called psychosis and the less severe ones called neurosis. So he admitted to Kingsley Hall those people who are suffering from more severe diseases. Of course, those people who suffered from less severe diseases were not banned from entering, but the place, Kingsley Hall, was basically used for admitting the more severely disturbed or mentally sick patients, such as schizophrenics. And what did they do in Kingsley Hall? I just described to you. They did seminars with psychiatrists, with social workers, with parents, with significant others, and the patients together. Seminars, discussions, dialogue. Then classes were held there of art, of painting, of sculpting, of stitching, सिलाई की, of knitting, कपड़े knit करने की, स्वेटर knit करने की classes और opportunities उनको दी गई. Opportunities दी गई for them to create things with clay. Now, all of these creative expressions, along with dialogues and discussions and seminars, were the methodologies used to create what R.D. Laing had called metanoia. And metanoia resulted in a changed mental state of the chronically sick mental patients, thereby helping them to recover. This was about R.D. Laing, one of the British and a very prominent anti-psychiatrist. Let us talk about another anti-psychiatry movement psychiatrist, and that is Aaron Esterson. Aaron Esterson was born in 1923 and he died in 1982. His main book, Leaves of Spring, is about a case that he dealt of a young girl who psychiatrists had diagnosed to have become schizophrenic. सारा का नाम उन्होंने स्किज़ोफ्रेनिया इंशिका के ज़हनी की फहरिस्त में शामिल किया. इन माहिरीन नफ्सियात ने, और उसको लेबल किया गया कि सारा जो है वो स्किज़ोफ्रेनिक है. Aaron Esterson took over the case of Sarah. Of course, ये फर्जी नाम है, उन्होंने अपनी किताब में फर्जी नाम बताया हुआ है. But the case is real, except the name is supposed to be not the real name. And he went on to show that Sarah's family was instrumental in labeling and creating the problem in Sarah's case. How was the family doing it? And this is the key concept in Esterson's theory of mental disorder. he put forward the view that Sarah's family selected Sarah as a scapegoat, and whatever was wrong in the family dynamics, the relationship amongst the family, those wrong things were projected onto this poor girl Sarah, young girl Sarah, and she was labeled a psychotic and a schizophrenic. एस्टसन के ख्याल में मेंटल डिजीज, खास तौर पे स्किज़ोफ्रेनिया, is due to the family selecting a person from within itself as a scapegoat and then putting all the negativity of the family onto this scapegoat. मिसाल के तौर पे एस्टसन ने देखा कि अगर सारा बैठ के सोचती थी तो उसके माँ या बाप जो हैं वो उन्होंने साइकियाट्रिस्ट्स और डॉक्टर्स को बताया कि ये सोचती बहुत ज्यादा है. अगर वो समझती थी कि उसकी चाय या कॉफी में दवाइयाँ मिक्स की जाती हैं तो वालिदैन ने ये बताया कि ये हम पर शक करती है. और जब साइकियाट्रिस्ट ने एस्टसन ने इस चीज को देखा कि क्या ये शक था या इसमें हकीकत थी, तो उसको मालूम हुआ कि सारा के माँ और बाप वाकई ही फिल हकीकत में उसकी चाय और कॉफी में उसको अद्वियात मिक्स करके पिलाते थे, क्योंकि वो ये समझते थे कि सारा बीमार है. और जब ये इस बात का शक करती थी सारा, दिस पेशेंट दैट एस्टसन टॉक्स अबाउट, देन शी वॉज ब्रांडेड एज, दिस डाउट वॉज यूज्ड एज ए सिम्टम इन हर ऑफ स्किज़ोफ्रेनिया. When she decided that her parents are not really in her favor, that her parents are with the psychiatrists and with the doctors, then she wanted to cut herself off from them. And this emotional detachment on her part was used by psychiatrists as to diagnose that she is a schizophrenic. आपको बात पहुंच रही है कि उसकी एग्जिस्टेंशियल या परसेप्चुअल रियलिटी जो थी वो उसके नजदीक बिल्कुल ठीक थी. उसके माँ बाप उसके साथ सख्ती से पेश आते थे, उसको दवाइयाँ मिक्स करके उसकी चाय और कॉफी में देते थे, और जब उसने उनसे किनारा कशी इख्तियार करने की कोशिश की तो उससे ये कहा गया कि ये इमोशनली डिटैच्ड है. नाउ वी नो दैट इमोशनल डिटैचमेंट इज ऑल्सो a symptom of schizophrenia. So the family around her proved to the doctors by showing that she doubts the intentions of the family, by showing that she is detached from the family, by showing that she has a persecution vision of the family, proved her to be a schizophrenic. And that is how Esterson says the family selected her as a scapegoat, and that is how Sarah, this girl, was branded as a schizophrenic. In Esterson's point of view, then scapegoating by the family, pressure by the family, scapegoating by the family is the main cause of the development of severe form of psychosis that we call schizophrenia. And that, in his point of view, unless the family is also involved in the treatment of the patient will fail to recover from his mental symptoms. आपको याद है आज का लेक्चर जब शुरू हुआ था तो मैंने आपसे गुजारिश की थी that we will be looking into the family therapy also. In this case, the anti-psychiatrists came to the rescue of this patient because they showed to the patient and the people who are treating her parents, her psychiatrists, and other significant others, that giving her drugs or ECT would not help her, because it is the family who is creating the problem in her by scapegoating. Scapegoating, of course, as you must have guessed, is a psychological phenomena where one person is selected by a number of other people and then held responsible for things that he or she may not have done, and then all the negative emotions of the group and the people around him are targeted on this scapegoat. This is exactly what was done, Esterson showed in the case of Sarah. And what was his method of treatment? His method of treatment was the same as adopted by R.D. Laing. That is, let us not label. Let us give the person the opportunities to express herself in art, in artisan, such as stitching, such as sculpting, involve her in discussions and dialogues, and above all, explain to the family what is scapegoating, and explain to the patient how she or he has become a target of scapegoating. कैसे वो फैमिली मेंबर्स के बेजा मुशद्ददाना रवैये का, तशद्दुद का और उनके मनफी जज्बात और एहसासात का शिकार बना है. तो इस तरह से एस्टरसन का ये ख्याल है कि फैमिली हैज़ ऑल्सो टू बी इन्वॉल्व्ड in the treatment of severely disturbed mental patients such as Sarah or schizophrenics. And that is what Esterson did. Involved the family, showed the family that what they are doing is interpreted, is understood rightly by the patient as something that upsets her, and that their reactions are actually one of the causes of her disease, of a person's disease. And that is the methodology used by Esterson. Involvement of family into the treatment regimen and showing to the patient that the family and people around her use her as a scapegoat, and that results in making a person more conscious, that helps in making the family aware of actually what they are doing, and thereby helps the patient to rise above and helps the family to curtail scapegoating, to get rid of scapegoating. That is how Aaron Esterson treats or says patients should be treated. Before we end today's lecture, let us take a look at what we have talked about today. We have talked about a very different and a novel approach to the treatment of mental disorder. That different and novel approach is called एंटी साइकाइट्री. मैंने आपको इसकी वजह भी बताई थी एंटी साइकाइट्री की, कि इसकी वजह तस्मिया क्या थी. that research had shown that some of the technologies used in biological methodologies, such as ECT, such as psychosurgery, do not help patients. These methodologies, in fact, may be harmful for some patients. Therefore, some psychologists had come to the realization that other than these biological methodologies need to be used. एक तो ये बात थी इसकी बैकग्राउंड में एंटी साइकाइट्री की. दूसरी मैंने आपको बात बताई थी, the experiment that was undertaken by Rosenhan and his associates, where they visited many mental hospitals and they saw that mental hospitals are not really helping patients, that mental hospitals may be pitiless, बेरहमी से पेश आते हैं, they are cruel to the patients, वो बहुत ज़्यादा जुल्म करते हैं इनमेट्स पे. और उन्होंने ये भी देखा that 80% of the patients who are released from mental hospitals go back, report back to mental hospitals after having been released. Such that the methodologies used by people who use the biological approaches are inadequate. Based upon these observations and based upon these experiences, we saw the emergence of what is called anti-psychiatry movement. We talked about two prominent anti-psychiatry movements proponents. One, a British psychiatrist, R.D. Laing. And R.D. Laing had talked about how an anxiety, an existential anxiety, or how one's existential philosophy may be a root cause of one's serious mental disease. He had also talked about division of self. He said that as a result of one's thinking, as a result of experience of one's existential self, one comes to have a division within the self. And that division within the self is seen by others as schizophrenia. Schizophrenia, therefore, is a division in the self. He also said that psychiatrists should not label mental diseases because labeling can be negative, and that labeling leads to people being categorized as mentally sick patient or people who are normal and healthy. That creates that division जिसके वो वैसे ही खिलाफ थे. So, what is his methodology of treatment of mental disorder? His methodology, as you remember, is to create metanoia. Metanoia is what? Metanoia is a heightened or a different state of mind, a different mindset. Metanoia, in R.D. Laing's point of view, can be created by, do you remember? Discussion, dialogue, seminars, exchange of ideas, exchange of words amongst people who understand, who appreciate, who are sympathetic to each other. And then metanoia can also be created by art, crafts, expressing oneself in one's paintings, expressing oneself in sculpture, expressing oneself in stitching, expressing oneself in making music, expressing oneself in dancing. All of these are expressions of the self that help to create a different mental state, a heightened mental state, which he called metanoia, which was, in his point of view, a method of treatment of mental disorder. The other person that we talked about in this regard was Aaron Esterson. Aaron Esterson, based upon his observation of schizophrenic patients, showed that the family of a schizophrenic patient may turn a person into schizophrenic. And if people could exchange ideas, if the family could also be involved in exchanging of ideas with the help of a psychologist or psychiatrist, then the schizophrenic would recover. Anti-psychiatry movement has made important contribution in understanding, number one, dynamics of mental disease, and number two, the treatment of mental diseases. Do take a look at it. Until next time, Khuda Hafiz, look after yourselves, be good, God be with you. Assalamu alaikum ji. History and Systems of Psychology, lecture number 41. We had touched upon a novel and a different idea in lecture 40. I hope you have been able to decipher and understand the main thrust of the idea. Today we are going to touch upon another different and novel idea in the development of psychology in the late 20th century. You won't find these ideas in conventional books of psychology and the history of psychology. Conventional books usually ignore the idea that we talked about in the last lecture. We consider that it is very, very important that you become aware of the main systems and ideas, whether they were within the main conventional stream or not, so long as they left an impact on the development of systems of psychology, we feel that you as undergrads must have some rudimentary, बुनियादी आगाही आपको उन आइडियाज़ के बारे में, उन सिस्टम्स के बारे में ज़रूर होनी चाहिए. और हमारी कोशिश भी यही है कि मुख्तलिफ आइडियाज़ जो 20वीं सदी में जिन्होंने नफ्सियात में अहम मकाम बनाया है अपने लिए, हम उनका भी आपसे तारुफ कराते जाएं. We will talk about another different and a novel idea which has a special application to Pakistan also. But before we touch upon that, let us review what we talked about the last time. If you remember, the last time we talked about anti-psychiatry movement. Anti-psychiatry movement, if you remember, was a revolt, a rebellion against some psychiatrists and some mental hospitals and mental institutions that misuse biological treatment of mental disorder. Not all psychiatrists across the globe and not all mental institutions across the globe suffer from the problems that anti-psychiatrists rose against, but the anti-psychiatry movement was targeted against or was aimed against those psychiatrists and those mental institutions that had failed to understand the real dynamics, in their view, in the view of the anti-psychiatrists, the real dynamics of severe mental diseases, and thereby mistreated the patients. ये मूवमेंट जो थी, इसकी रिव्यू के लिए आपको मैं याद दहानी कराऊं कि रोजनहान ने अपने कुछ कॉलीग्स के साथ और कुछ हमख्याल लोगों के साथ मिलके they got themselves admitted in